And all right, hello everyone. Hello, hello, hello. We should be live. Please refresh your pages. We are live. Please refresh your pages. And could everyone just do me a huge favor and let me know in the chat when you're able to see us and hear us. So again, just a quick favor in the chat. Could you just let me know when you can see us and hear us? Now, I actually ask this because I had a terrible experience once upon a time. Greg, I don't know if this has ever happened, if you've ever had any like big mess ups when you were going live. It was one of like my first ever webinars, and I thought everything was going really well. And then I went back into the chat after a couple of minutes, and everyone is saying like, your microphone is broken, like you're sharing the wrong screen. Like now I always ask at the beginning, like, can everyone see and hear?
Yep.
So that's why I always post in the chat at the beginning.
I have nightmares about that.
Well, what did you ever have any
I
early?
never did, but I'm always afraid, so I always do the same thing. I triple check everything because it's scary to think.
All right, and it looks like folks can see and hear us. So I guess my second request for everyone would be to just let me know, like, where are you joining us from? So I'm already seeing plenty of activity in here. I'm seeing people joining from, hold on, there's a big list here. So Kansas, Charlotte, North Carolina, Wilmington, Northeast North Carolina, lots of North Carolina representing today. Northeast Florida, Maryland, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Arizona, New York City, Houston, Goodyear, Arizona, Prairie, Texas, New York, Batesville, Indiana, Daytona, Florida, Richardson, Texas, New York City, Toronto, Cincinnati, South Carolina, Chicago, Arizona, Dallas, Connecticut, and the pace is increasing here. So lots of folks tuning in today. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We've got Greg with us from Pilot Institute, and we've got an incredible webinar planned for all of you. Now, before we get started, I just actually had a few like quick logistical notes to share with everyone just to make your experience as good as possible. So I'm just gonna very quickly share my screen with everyone. All right, so when you're watching the webinar, you're gonna be looking at a screen like this. You have your video and then you have the chat on the right. Now, if at any point you're seeing the slides and they're a little blurry or hard to read or out of focus, just make sure you're watching at the highest quality. Click the gear button in the bottom right-hand corner of the video. Make sure the quality is the highest, 720p. Now, if things are still a little bit small for you, no worries. You can go full screen at any time. Just hit the full screen button in the lower right. Just know that you won't see the chat at that point. So you'll have to exit full screen to see or ask questions in the chat. You can always enter and exit full screen anytime. Now, I will be taking questions during the webinar and writing them down for Greg to answer and during the Q&A at the end. But there's one question, which I'm going to answer right now, and I don't want to answer it again. This is the big question. Yes, there will be a replay. You will get a replay automatically. It'll come to your email. So I need everyone's help here. If you see someone in the chat ask, is there going to be a replay? Can you just help me out and say, yes, there will be a replay? Now, with all that out of the way, I wanted to introduce Greg from Pilot Institute. Greg, I know you got a lot to share with us today, so I'll let you take it away.
All right, thank you, Cameron. Appreciate it. I'm gonna get started here, sharing my screen, and there we go. And I'm really excited because this is what I do. This is my passion. I live for training people to become pilots, and we get a ton of questions on a regular basis about what does it take to become a pilot. And there's different levels of pilots, and we'll talk about this in this webinar. And here's the list of the things that I want to cover today. The first one is, what are the different types of certificates? People say, I want to be a pilot. Well, there's different levels if you want, and we'll talk about all these. I'm going to talk about the number of hours that it takes, and I'm going to talk about flight hours, and then I'm going to talk also about ground training because it's a combination of the two. And then we'll talk about the different steps that it takes to become a pilot. You're going to have to do ground training, you're going to have to do flight training, you're going to have to do a check ride, you're going to have, there's different words that you need to become familiar with. And I'm going to give you some tips on how to save money in this business. I'm not going to lie, and I'm going to say it right now, flying is expensive, and we have to be realistic about it. So I'm going to give you some tips that I've learned over the years, how this works, and I'll give you a little bit of my background, and you'll learn quickly why I have some really good tips because, well, I've been doing this for a while, and I've been around flight schools quite a bit. And then the last tip I'm going to give you is how to select a flight school. At the end of this, if you're really interested, you're going to have to find a flight school to do all of this. And I'll give you, again, some tips from having been in this business for a while. Who is this not for? It's not going to be for you if you're already a pilot. You probably know everything I'm going to talk about. And I always put a little bit of a joke in here where I say, if you don't like the word license and you prefer the word certificate, then this is not going to be for you because I use both words. Now, the joke in here is that a lot of people say, well, this is not a license, it's a certificate. And actually the FAA uses both of these terms, so I always joke about it. I use both terms and it's fine. Nobody will be offended by that. I'm putting this right here. You can see in the background right now, we have a flight that's going on using Microsoft Flight Simulator. And I set it up to go from Prescott, which is where I live, to go all the way to Tucson. And you can see right here, I pulled the map this morning and it's 3 hours and 18 minutes to drive from Prescott to Tucson. At the end of this webinar, we're going to find out where we are on our route to Prescott. Now, I'm not flying this thing. I put it on autopilot, so it's doing its own thing. So we'll see the progress as we get in there. And hopefully you don't see a mountain in the background. We're flying around 9,000 feet right now, cruising at 9,000 feet, going all the way out there. So a little bit more about myself. I'm the owner and the lead instructor at Pilot Institute. At the moment, we have almost 35,000 students in our system, and these students have enrolled in 46,000 different, not courses, but enrollment, if you want. So our students like our courses. They buy more than one course in general, and we love that. We love teaching our students anything they need to know. My background is I'm a certified flight instructor. I'm a commercial pilot. I'm also a remote pilot, which means I can fly my drone for commercial purposes. Drone training is also something that we do separately from airplane training. And I've got 20 years of experience in this business. I've managed flight schools. I've been the president of a flight school. I was the assistant vice president for a very large flight training program in Florida. We had 500 students. We had 50 aircraft. And this is kind of my background. So when I give you tips on how to choose flight schools, I know what I'm talking about because I've been doing this for a long time. And the next thing is I'm also a university professor. So I've taught at the university, and I still do teach at the university level aviation courses and UAS, unmanned aircraft courses. I have a master's degree in aviation and human factors from the Florida Institute of Technology, which is where I worked for a long time. So let's get to it. Let's talk about the different types of certificates. And this is kind of a part that's sometimes confusing because as you can see the list, there's quite a few. It starts with the student pilot certificate. And I'm going to give you more details about these, by the way, in a second. I just want to introduce them right now. So student pilot certificate, it's kind of the lower level. And then we have 3 possible options where you can go from getting your student pilot certificates. You can get a recreational pilot license, you can get a sport pilot license, or a private pilot license. Now, you see I put recreational in parentheses. I'm not going to talk about the recreational pilot certificate because I think most people that want to fly, they're going to go either for sport or for private. The recreational pilot is only a few hundred people in the country that have that license. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but then we'll talk about the commercial pilot license and the airline transport pilot license. And there's always a lot of questions about these two. So let's take a look. Student pilot certificate. This is like your learner's permit, if you want. It's actually fairly limited what you can do with the certificate. The only thing really that it allows you to do is to fly by yourself. We call it solo, when you're doing your private pilot training or when you're doing your sport pilot training. So this will be basically something that will get signed off by your instructor, and the instructor is going to say, go fly, but you need to have the student pilot certificate with you. In order to qualify for this, you need to be at least 16 years old and you need to be able to read, speak, and understand English. That English requirement applies to every single license. So I'm not going to repeat it, but because I don't mention it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Every single certificate that the FAA issues requires an English proficiency. The student pilot certificate, the cool thing about it is that it's free. You can meet with your instructor, fill out a piece of paper, well, actually go online on the FAA website, fill out the application, your instructor is going to sign it, and then that's it. Then you'll get the paper in the mail. You'll be getting a certificate in the mail that's going to show you, that's going to basically say that you're a student pilot. It's a little card. And then when you have this, now there are limitations, there are restrictions to that student pilot certificate. First off, you cannot fly alone without an instructor endorsement. Somebody needs to write on that piece of paper, or actually write in your logbook, to say that you're proficient to go fly on your own. It's not like you can take your parents' car and then just go drive it when you don't have a license just yet. Well, you shouldn't be doing that, but you definitely don't want to do that with an airplane. And you cannot carry passengers. So here you're going to be limited to flying solo, like I said before, and you'll be able to do some cross countries. You'll be able to do some local, we call them touch and go, where you're going to be doing landings and takeoff and landings and takeoff, always supervised by your flight instructor. And obviously you cannot make any compensation for this. We'll talk about the compensation part because that happens way later in your certificate. You cannot make money from flying with your student pilot certificate. The next level is going to be your sport pilot certificate. In this case, you need to be 17 to become a sport pilot. And that sport pilot is going to have a few limitations. The first one is, well, I'll get to the limitations in a second. The first one is you need to have a medical certificate or just a driver's license. Now, this is the part that's very appealing to people that don't want to pass a medical certificate. You're going to be required at one point, I'll talk about it in a little bit, to get a very specific, it's an aviation medical certificate. And sometimes if you have health issues, you may not qualify for that certificate. In this case, you can actually fall back on the sport pilot certificate, and that's the big appeal for this license here. The same principle applies that we had on the student pilot certificate. You cannot fly alone without an instructor endorsement when you're what we call in command of a light sport aircraft. Now we call it sport because you have to fly what's called a light sport aircraft. And this is a picture right here you see in the corner. This is a light sport aircraft, which is going to be smaller, cannot carry as many people in it, and usually is going to go a little bit slower than a typical, a non-sport aircraft, I should say. The minimum number of hours that you're going to need to get this license is 20 hours. And when I say 20 hours, it's flight time. So spent inside of the aircraft and logged in your logbook, it's going to be 20 hours. By the way, this right here that's running in the background, this does not count in your logbook. It doesn't count as hours. With the sport pilot, there are some limitations. You cannot carry more than one passenger. Once you get your ticket, once you get your certificate, you cannot carry more than one passenger. You cannot receive compensation, which is the same for the private pilot. And if the visibility outside is less than 3 statute miles, 3 miles, then you cannot fly with your aircraft. And what this basically means is that there's a distance. If you sit right here and you look 3 statute miles in this direction, or 3 miles, statute miles is the term that we use in aviation, it's just 3 miles. If you look 3 miles in this direction, then if you can't see the object, then you can't fly. Now it's all reported. We have weather report that we look at to find out if it's 3 statute miles, but I don't want to bore you with the details here. Next level, so that's your sport pilot. The next level is going to be your private pilot, which is one of the most popular certificate out there. You need to be at least 17 years old to get this one. But if you do it in a glider, if you do it in a balloon, then you can be 16 years old. And you have to pass a written exam. You have to pass a practical test. And I'll get back to those two because they're important. You're going to have to be tested both for your knowledge and also for your flying skills. So that's what these two tests are right here. In terms of medical certificate, you need to have what we call a 3rd class medical certificate. There's 3 classes, 1, 2, and 3. 3 is the more lenient, I would call it, the easiest one to get. So you need to have at least a 3rd class medical certificate. And then you need to have 40 hours of total flight time in your logbook. And of these 40 hours, you need to have at least 20 hours of dual time. We call it dual, which means dual with an instructor. It's called instruction time. And then 10 hours of solo. Now you're going to say 20 plus 10, that's only 30. Yeah, the next 10 hours to get to 40, it can be a combination of those two, but you need at least 20 dual, 10 hours of solo, and then whatever else takes you to 40. I'm going to talk about these minimums again in a minute because it's a nice little round number, but the reality is a little bit different, and it's something that you need to know. With a private pilot license, you can carry passengers, and that's the great thing. That's the big difference between private pilot and a sport pilot, is you don't really have a limitation on the number of passengers. One of the other limitations is you cannot pay what we call less than the pro rata share of the expenses. So in this case, if you go fly with somebody else, just one other passenger, it means that you cannot have them pay for more than half of the flight. If you go with 2 passengers, now it's 3 people total in the airplane, you cannot have them pay for more than 1/3 of the expenses. Now you can pay for all of it if you wanted to, that's fine. You just can't have other people pay for it, because then the FAA says, well, this is a commercial operation because now you have other people pay for the entirety of the flight. And the FAA doesn't want you to do that as a private pilot. And then and also there's a little bit of a rule in here that says that you can fly in connection with your business as long as your business is not related to transporting passengers. Let's say that you're a doctor and you live in a rural area and you need to fly to go see your patients. You can do it as a private pilot because it's incidental to your business. It's part of your business. But you can't go and tell your friends, hey, I'm going to fly to Tucson, for example, where we're going, and I'm going to charge you $200 for the flight, and then come on board. So you can't do that. And then that's kind of what I said right here: the compensation or higher. You can't basically hold yourself out to other people and sell your services. That you can do if you're a commercial pilot. So commercial pilot is the next level up. You can be compensated for your flights. You can start making money off of being a pilot. You need to be at least 18 years old to do this. You need to also pass a knowledge test and a practical test. Again, I'll get back to those 2 in a minute. And in this case, you need to have a 2nd class medical certificate, the next level up. So 3rd class, now we need a 2nd class medical certificate. And the big caveat right here is you need 250 hours of total flight time. So we went from 40 hours to be a private pilot. Now you need to have 250 hours of total flight time. There are other requirements. You need to have done a long cross country. But the basic number is 250. And then at the very highest level, we have the Airline Transport Pilot. We call it ATP. And ATP is as high as you can be. If you have an ATP in your pocket, you've reached the highest level of certificate that you can get. This is what is required to fly for an airline. You want to fly for Delta, you want to fly for United, for American, then you're going to need to have, or even for any kind of cargo, UPS and FedEx, you're also going to need to have your ATP. Now the minimums are way, way higher. We go from 250 to 150 hours to now 1,500 hours. And there are some exceptions out there. If you're out of the military, it's going to be 750. If you're out of a 4-year degree college that qualifies, then it's going to be 1,000 hours, or it's going to be 1,250 if you're out of a 2-year degree college. So there are exceptions in here between 750 and 1,500. Now, a lot of people say, how do you get that many hours? Well, you do what I did. You become a flight instructor, and then you teach people how to fly. And in this case, then you're going to get your hours. And once you have 1,500 hours, then you can apply for the airlines. So you need to be also at least 23 years old in order to get that ATP. So if you're somebody who's pretty young, then it's going to take a little bit of time to get all that knowledge and get to that higher certificate. There are other options out there. You can have what we call an instrument rating. The instrument rating is going to help you fly in the clouds. Now you see that in the back right here, we have a clear, beautiful blue sky, which is what we get over Arizona most of the time. But if we started having clouds, you can't go fly in those clouds unless you have this instrument rating right here. You also need to get a type rating if you're going to fly a larger aircraft. And if you fly something like a 737, if you fly an Airbus A320, then you're going to have to get a specific training to that specific aircraft, and we call that a type rating. You can also become a flight instructor. That's another certificate on top of being a pilot. You can also be an instructor. Now, I have a card in my wallet that has I have a card for my commercial pilot certificate, and I also have a card for my flight instructor certificate. And then also I have one for remote pilot, which is what we have here, which is to fly drones for commercial purposes. And this is kind of a different type of training that I'm not going to talk about in here, but we do have a webinar actually with Teachable on how to do this as well. And then once you get your certificate, once you get your private pilot certificate or your commercial pilot certificate, then there are different types of airplane that you can fly. Single engine airplane. The one that's flying right now in the background is a Cessna 172. It's a single engine airplane, only has one engine in the front. You can get a multi-engine rating to fly something with more than one engine. I have that attached to my certificate. So in the back of my certificate, it says commercial pilot, single and multi-engine land as in not water, and then instrument rating, because that's what I have on mine. I don't have a type rating. And then you can also get that for C. So you could get a single engine C, so you can land on water, or a multi-engine C, so you can basically land a multi-engine airplane on water. I don't have the C ratings on mine. I only have land, single, and multi-engine. So I hope this clarifies it. It kind of makes it a little bit more complicated, but there are different branches. There are different ways that you can get all of this. But the typical path for anyone who's going to be becoming an airline pilot, and I know a lot of you that are watching, that's probably your goal, then this is what you're going to have to follow. First off, you have to get a private pilot. You cannot get to the higher certificates without first getting a private pilot. Then you go for your instrument rating, and then you're going to get your commercial pilot certificate, single engine, and then multi-engine. Some people do multi-engine first and then single engine. It doesn't really matter, quite frankly. And then lastly, you're going to get your ATP. Somewhere in here, you can get your flight instructor certificate, which is an additional certificate on top of all this. But this right here is the typical path for most people from point A to point B if being an airline pilot is what you want to do. And I've talked about medical certificates, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit more about the details in here. Those are required for pretty much every certificate except for sport. So private, commercial, and ATP are going to require to have a medical certificate. And they're issued by a special type of doctor. We call them AME, Aviation Medical Examiners. And these AMEs have gone through specific training. They know the standards that the FAA is looking for, and they're going to issue your certificate. So when you apply for this certificate, you're going to say, I want to get a first class, I want to get a second class, or I want to get a third class medical. First class is required for ATP privileges. If you want to be an airline transport pilot, that's the highest level of pilotage. That's the highest level of medical certificate that you can get. It's the hardest one to get. If you have any health issues, then it's going to be harder to get this one. Second class, if you're going to be acting as a commercial pilot, then you need to get a second class. And then your third class for private and for recreational. I didn't talk about recreational, but that requires a third class as well. There's a question that I get from students. I don't have a slide for it, but people say, what kind of medical should I get? And my question is to you, what do you want to do? Do you just want to be a private pilot? And I said just, not in a diminishing way at all. I said just because you don't want to go higher, then get a third class medical certificate. That's all you need. If you plan to be an airline pilot eventually down the road, then I want you to get a first class medical certificate, because you want to make sure that you can get that certificate and that you don't have something that is going to disqualify you from getting this. I had one horror story from a student in one of my flight programs that got a third class medical certificate and then waited and waited and waited. And eventually he got to the higher level and he tried for the first class and he failed because he had a heart issue that he didn't know about. And then he did all this training for nothing. He wanted to be an airline pilot and he couldn't. So medical is pretty much the first thing that you're going to do. And I'll get back to that, but don't do the same thing that this person did. And please get, if you want to get to the higher level, get your first class medical. So becoming a private pilot, we're going to start with the first level. How does it work? What do you have to do? And you need to do two things. We need to receive ground training and we need to receive flight training. And ground training is going to be done by a ground school. And this is what we do at Pilot Institute. We teach ground school. We teach it online, so you can do it from anywhere in the world. And we're going to get you ready for a knowledge test. That knowledge test is put out by the FAA, and it's, you'll see, I'll tell you more about the details, but it's a multiple choice question test. And we'll give you all the knowledge that you need in order to pass this. So we are a ground school. We don't do flight training. We don't have airplanes. So you'll have to go to a flight school in order to do all the flight training. So all the stuff in person, flying the airplane, quite frankly, all the fun stuff, then you're going to be doing this with the flight school. And that's where you're going to get all your proficiency to fly the airplane. So I want this to make clear because I know a lot of people have questions about this. And talking about the written exam, what we have is you have, for the private pilot, it's 60 questions, it's multiple choice questions. You have 2 hours to complete it, and you need to get at least 70% to complete the exam. The good news is our students, they're awesome. They are. We have over a 99% pass rate for this exam. And not only that, but we also have the average score is 93 on the exam. So 70 is the bare minimum. This should not be your goal, okay? And we don't teach for you to just pass the test. We teach you to get way more than 70 and ace the exam. And this is important. You need to learn everything you need to know, not just to pass the test, but also to basically be proficient flying out there. And this exam cannot be taken online. I know you're probably going to ask, even during what we're going through right now, you have to go to a testing center. The cost is $160 that goes straight to the testing center. And there's a list. We'll give you a list in the course of where you need to get, where you can schedule your exam. There's about 700 to 800 different testing centers in the country. So I'm sure there will be one near you. And just go to the center, pass the test, and then it'll be all good. That's the first step. Now, to study for this exam, there's 4 different ways you can do it. The first one is to do a self-study. And the self-study means you're going to get the books. And I'm not joking by the picture that's in here. That's what the books are going to look like. There's going to be a lot of knowledge. And you can try. And I don't recommend it. And I know this is this might sound biased, but I don't recommend that you self-study. And the reason is you don't know what you don't know. And when I say this, I mean that you're basically studying for something that you don't know what you're looking for, really. We do, because I've been doing this for a long time. I'm a flight instructor, and I know what I need to teach you. But you may be reading the book and you're like, do I need to know this? Do I not need to know this? Or you may be reading the book and there's things in the book that are not there that you need to know. So trust someone, trust a professional to do this. And that's the other option. You can do an in-person class. I've taught in-person class, and I still do, quite frankly. But the big downside with in-person class is that you can't pause. If there's something you don't understand, either you raise your hand and you say, I don't get it, can you please go over it? And there's 20 other people around you that may not get it, or they may have gotten it. And then the instructor is going to re-explain, and maybe you still don't get it. You can't pause, you can't rewind. It's very difficult to do this. So that's one of the downside with in-person. Also, it's going to be not on your own schedule. So you're going to have to go, when I taught it at a flight school, we did it in the evenings. So we did it at, excuse me, we did it at 6 o'clock, and you show up in class, and it was 2 or 3 times a week. You show up at 6 o'clock, and then you basically sit there for an hour and a half, 2 hours. And if you get tired after 2 hours, well, you have to stay there because you can't pause. So that's the downside with in-person class. You can also do it one-on-one, and the big downside with one-on-one is it's going to be expensive. An average instructor is going to charge about $60 to $70 an hour to do this. Take, for example, our ground school, it's about 35 hours. Imagine spending 35 hours and spending $60 or $70 per hour with an instructor. So not really an option. I know some places do it, but you don't get the depth because you're going to be spending a whole lot of money. And the last one is obviously an online ground school, which is what we do. So the online ground school is a lot cheaper most of the time. Ours is $274, and you can see a link right here if you want to sign up for it. You can watch, it's 35 hours. You can watch it whenever you want from anywhere in the world. If you have a cell phone, you can watch it on your cell phone, an iPad, a computer, anything you want, you can watch it there. You can pause, you can rewind, you can do it as many times as you want. And not only that, but you have lifetime access. You can do it as long as you want and just continue learning. And the next thing is, oops, sorry. The next thing is,
yeah. Greg, I just want to let you know that I know that you didn't plan this or anything, but all the people, there are already people in the chat, like Marty, who has said, I'm a student of this course right now. I just passed my Part 107 with a 97%. And other folks saying, Steven says, I'm a current student. This course is amazing. So there's already testimonials coming in.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So just wanted to let you know because you can't see the chat.
Well, thank you. Well, and I'm telling you, our students are awesome. I wake up every single day, and I probably have 20 different emails, questions from students, and that's the first thing I do. I wake up at 5 in the morning, and then by 5:30, I've answered everyone, and it's just so amazing to see the feedback from the students. So I'm so glad you said that. The ground school is free support. Like I just said it actually. I wake up and I answer all your questions. I don't charge you for it, and I do it because I love it. I just love helping the students, and I see that light bulb sometimes going on in their head. They have a question, it's not clear, and then I re-explain it, and they're like, oh, it makes sense. And that's to me, that's the best reward when I see that light bulb going on in their head. And you can reuse our course for refreshers every 2 years, every 3 years, whenever you have to go back. Maybe you stop flying for a while and you want to come back after 5 years, then it's all right here. It's all available and it's all updated. I make updates all the time. And then we have quizzes you can use throughout the course. We have practice exam. I have 850 questions in our database, and you can basically just go in there and practice just like you would for the FAA exam. And that's why our students, I think, are so successful, because they see not the exact question, but they see a question that's going to resemble what you'll get on the actual exam. And then we have a really cool community of students that you can have access to on Facebook and ask questions, and everybody's going to be there, and myself included. I go in there and answer questions. So the next question that I get a lot is, when should I pass the written exam? And that's a really good question, because I've talked about the fact you need to do ground school and you need to do flight school. You can start training at any time. You can start doing the ground school before you do the flight training. And I actually recommend it, because I'm going to give you tips not only on how to choose a flight school. I have a ton of questions that you need to ask the flight schools, but I'm also going to tell you some of the basic things, so that when you show up at the airplane, you're not going to be like, oh, what is this thing? Okay, I'm going to tell you what a wing is. I'm going to tell you what the flaps are, what the ailerons do, how the flight controls work. So by the time you get in the airplane, you have at least a little bit of background. So you can start anytime. The ground school, you can do it before. I recommend that you take your written exam before you do your first solo. Now you're going to say, where's the solo in the entire training? Solo happens around 10 to 15 to 20 hours of total time. So not about halfway, but about a third of the way through. That's when you want to start doing, that's when you want to pass your written exam. So those 35 hours of training that I'm giving you, you should be cramming this early on. Not necessarily cramming, but you should be doing all that before you get too far into the flight training. And then once you take that exam, you're going to get a piece of paper, and that piece of paper is valid for 24 months. Now it says calendar months in here. That's kind of the technical term that we use. It's good for 2 years. Okay, so you have to take your check ride, your actual check ride with the FAA within 2 years. Otherwise, that certificate is going to expire. So make sure you don't take it too early, but make sure you also don't wait too long. It's kind of a balance. Now you're going to say, can I do all the training before I even get into an airplane? Absolutely. And actually some flight schools require that you do all the ground training before you get to them. I don't know that I would recommend it, because I think it helps to go in the airplane once in a while, because some of the things are going to fall in and you're going to be like, oh yeah, it makes sense because I've seen it in the airplane. So I recommend that you do it at the same time, but some people do it all at once. So not a problem. Do not go fly and then wait and then do ground school at the very end. That's a terrible idea. That's going to cost you a lot more money at the end. And then the flight training, you'll have to do flight training at a flight school near you. And then during the flight training, it's going to be divided into 3 different parts: pre-solo training, pre-cross-country training, and then pre-final check ride. And that's kind of the big steps, if you want. The first solo is your goal. At first, you need to go out there without your training wheels, without your flight instructor, because your flight instructor is going to be always sitting next to you. And this is my right, by the way. The instructor sits on the right side of you. So the instructor is going to be sitting on the right. And then at one point, you're going to go by yourself. And this is the most amazing feeling, by the way. I did this almost 20 years ago now. My first solo, actually more than 20 years ago. And I still remember it, because it's such an amazing feeling to be out there flying an airplane on your own. And now you don't have your instructor, and you really have to perform. Otherwise you can get in trouble, but you'll be ready. Okay. And then the next thing is going to be your cross-country training. We're going to go from point A to point B, just like what I'm doing right here. This is the cool thing about flying. You know, it's not about doing stalls. It's not about doing steep turns, which are some of the maneuvers that you do. It's about going from point A to point B. Going from Prescott to Tucson in an hour instead of 3 hours, that's a big deal, okay? And then the last part is going to be your pre-exam. Make sure everything is good, and then send you out to go for your check ride. Speaking of the check ride, this is the practical test. This is the very last thing that you're going to do before you get your certificate. And it's two different things. It's an oral exam and it's a flight check. And the oral exam is going to be you and the inspector, the examiner sitting across from you, and that person is going to grill you. And they're going to say, okay, we're going today from Prescott to Tucson, and tell me what we're going to do. Show me your planning. And then he or she is going to ask you a question. They're going to say, how about this regulation? Do you know about this regulation? How about we get en route and then suddenly the weather is bad? How did you check the weather? So there's a lot of things they're going to ask you. It's going to last probably about 2 to 3 hours. And if you succeed, then you move on to the flight part. And the flight part is getting in the airplane, making sure that you can fly the airplane from point A to point B, do a bunch of maneuvers, and that's going to be about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And by the time you're done, you've sweated bullets, and then if you're good, then you have your certificate. So you're going to have to do this, by the way, for every single certificate, for your private, for your instrument, for your commercial, for your ATP, for your multi-engine. You're going to have to do one of these. We call it a check ride. So that's fun. You can tell I'm excited about it. These are conducted by 3 different types of people. Either somebody straight from the FAA called an ASI, they're an inspector, or somebody who works on behalf of the FAA, they're a third party, they're called DPE. This is more than likely who you're going to be using. And then the last thing is going to be maybe somebody from your flight school. If your flight school has this type of check pilot, we call them check pilots, then you're going to do it with them. And I'll talk about this in a second. And if you do it with a DPE, again, the most common way of getting your certificate is with a DPE. It's going to cost you quite a bit of money, between $400 and $800, depending on where you live in the country. In Arizona, it's about $600 or $700 right now for the check ride. So that's something that you need to budget for, and it's really important that you do, okay? The next thing, what happens if you fail? And you know what? It happens. I've only, and I'm going to admit to something here. I've only ever failed one check ride. I failed the oral for my instrument rating, and I failed it because of one question. So that's how difficult it can be. There was one piece of regulation. I blame my instructor, probably shouldn't, but said my instructor didn't teach me, and I didn't know that piece of regulation. So I had to go back, get recurrent training, and then basically go back up. So that's the only check ride I ever failed of all of them. And all my flights I passed the first time. So if you fail the oral, like I did, okay, you fail the oral portion, then you have to get recurrent training from the instructor. They're going to sign you off and then send you back again with the check pilot. If you pass the oral and then you go to the flight, then whatever you fail, if you fail anything during the flight, then you're going to have, when you come back, the check pilot is going to say, well, these steep turns, they're not within standards. So you have to do that again. You basically have to go and fly again with doing your steep turns. So that's it. Hopefully it doesn't happen. Don't stress yourself too much about this. Okay, failures happen. It's not a big deal. Well, it's not a big deal, and you'll get over it and then move on. So let's get to talking about flight schools. How do we choose a flight school? And this is difficult. For those of you that are married, I'm going to equal it to finding a photographer for your wedding. Okay, you want to find the place that's going to work well for you. You want to make sure that when you go to that flight school that you feel comfortable, because you're going to be spending a lot of money there. And when I say a lot of money, I'm going to give you some figures in a minute, but we're talking about the thousands of dollars or even close to the tens of thousands of dollars. So you need to find a place that works for you, that works for your learning styles and also works for your budget. There are different types of airplanes that you're going to be flying out there, from a very simple Cessna 150, which is a pretty small aircraft, fits only 2 people, to something much larger, like or much more faster, much more expensive, like a Cirrus SR-20, SR-22, which is going to cost a lot more money. So when you go to the flight school, if you have a budget that's on the low end, then you're not going to go for a flight school that has a Cirrus, because it's going to blow your budget. So you need to do some research. And I'm not going to give you, unfortunately, I don't have time to give you all the tips that I give in my private pilot, but in the private pilot course, I give you a list of all the questions that you need to ask for flight schools. But when you pick a flight schools, 4 things actually, there's one more on the other slide. What is your goal? Do you want to be a private pilot only, or do you just want to go and fly for an airline eventually? If you want to go fly for an airline, consider joining a degree program, a 4-year university program, or a program that's going to get you ready to become a commercial pilot. There are flight schools out there that basically focus on just doing that, not just the private pilot, but everything else around. So if that's what you want to do, then go ahead and do that. If you want to fly for fun, then you can go to a flight school that's more laid back, more traditional, and it's just going to give you your private pilot, maybe your instrument rating. The next thing is going to be your location. This is important. Do you have a flight school right at your airport, at the local airport, or do you need to drive several hours to get to your flight school? When I did my private pilot in France, I did training at, and I had to take the train. I had to take the train for about 45 minutes to go to my lessons, and it happens, okay? Sometimes people move. I had students when I was in charge of a flight school in Arizona. They came to us for 3 weeks or 4 weeks. They rented an apartment or stayed in a hotel, an extended stay, and they crammed their flight training for that short period of time. And then they would go back and work, and then they would come back again the next season. Somebody worked in Alaska, and in the winter they would come to us and do the training here because they couldn't really do much with their job during that time. So that's something to consider as well. Do you have to move somewhere in order to do this? That's fine. You know, it's an option as well. And the last thing is going to be your time dedication. Can you do this by flying on the weekend, by flying in the afternoons, by flying full time? Okay, some students do that. They go fly full time when you're younger and you can go to flight school. You don't have a family. So you have to take that into account as well if that's something you can do. And then the next thing is obviously your budget. Now, I'm going to give you a tip, and I want you to write it down. Now, don't write it down, but I want you to remember this because it is so true. Everything in aviation is going to take longer than expected, and it's going to cost more than expected. Okay, I'm going to say it again. Everything is going to be more expensive than expected, and it's going to take longer than expected. So if you budgeted for $5,000, I can guarantee you already, it's not going to cost $5,000. It's going to cost more than that. If they told you were going to do it in 3 weeks or 4 weeks, it's going to be longer than that. So you have to just remember those things, and you'll come back. If you take my ground school, you're going to come back like other students, and other students have commented right here when I said that, and they said you were so right. And so I've seen it happen. A few things that you need to know, because when you go to flight schools, they may not always tell you about those things. And I'm not going to say that all flight schools are bad, because that is not true. There's actually the majority of flight schools out there want to see you succeed, but there's a few of them that are going to make it sugarcoat it. They're going to make it better than it looks because they want you to sign up. And so I want to give you a kind of be very open about what you're going to pay for. And there's accessories that you're going to have to pay for, okay? You're going to have to buy a headset, like the one in the picture right here. And those are expensive, okay? They're $400 on the cheaper end to over $1,000 if you get the more fancy stuff. You're going to need to get a fuel sump. A fuel sump is something you're going to use to check the fuel in the airplane. You're going to need a flashlight. You're going to need a flight bag. You're going to need a logbook. You're going to need a medical exam. You're going to need to have a flight computer. Now, a flight computer is not something fancy like a laptop or anything, but that's going to be an additional expense. You're going to need to buy books. You're going to need to buy an e-pad. More than likely, you're going to be using an iPad. So now you can see the list is adding on and on and on. So that's something that you need to know. You're going to have more than likely what's on the quote from the flight school. Also, something that flight schools don't always tell you, they're going to charge you for every minute that you spend with a flight instructor and or with the airplane. When you get to your flight instructor, by the way, gets paid by the hour. So when you first sit down with he or she, then you're going to do a pre-brief. Before you get in the airplane, we're going to have to make sure that you know what we're going to do for that lesson. That can last between 15 minutes to 30 minutes. So you're going to get charged for that time. And when you come back, we're going to do a post-brief. When you add up the pre-brief and the post-brief, it's about 30 minutes to sometimes 45 minutes to an hour. So this is something that you need to consider and you need to remember. Like I said, flight instructors are paid hourly, which means that if you don't show up, your instructor doesn't get paid. And I'm saying this as a former instructor who sat in instructor lounge because my student decided to not show up. And then now I'm sitting there for an hour and a half because I don't have a student. So please remember this. Please be considerate with your instructor. It's a tough job. You work long hours. You're outside in the airplane. Sometimes it's hot. Sometimes it's cold. It's a tough environment. It really is. So just remember that with your instructor. Let's talk about minimums, because I think this is where most flight schools will lie to you and it's going to cost you a lot of money. So I want to give you the information right here. In order to get your private pilot certificate, you need to meet a certain number of hours. I've talked about this, 40 hours, 20 dual, 10 hours of solo, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? The schools are going to quote you, most of the schools are going to quote you based on these minimums. They're going to say, well, the FAA says it takes 40 hours to get your certificate. Here's a quote for 40 hours, 20 hours of dual, 10 hours of solo, and then a little bit of extra. And guess what? Well, that's not how it works. The reality is that 40 hours is the bare minimum. And I can tell you, I've been doing this for 20 years. I can tell you how many students I have seen finish the course in 40 hours, and it fits on these 10 fingers right here. Actually, we had one student recently who didn't train with me for the flight training, but he did our ground school, and he came back and he told me he finished in 40 hours. I actually interviewed him. If you want to go on our, if you type Pilot Institute airplane on YouTube, you'll find our channel and you'll see the video there. And his name is Lee. And he did everything that you're supposed to do it the right way. I wish I could have played actually this interview that I did with him, because if you want to learn how to do it, he did exactly the right thing. So that's how you're going to do it, is by following what he did. So go and find it. Not right now, stay right here. We're not done. But so the national average is closer to 60 or 75 hours. That's a big difference. That's 50% more than what you may be getting a quote for. So when you go to your flight school, you're going to say, I don't want a quote for 40 hours. I want a quote for the minimums, because now you're going to get a more realistic view of what it's going to cost. That quote doesn't mean that this is how you're going to finish. Remember, it's an average, which means that some people finished below that average, some people finished above that average. I've seen people take 100 hours to get their flight training done. So I'm not saying this is going to be your case, but you need to be ready and you need to understand what it's going to take to do this. Okay. Part 61 versus part 141. I want to check on time and make sure that I'm not going too long. Part 61 versus 141. This is a question I get all the time. You're going to say, what does that even mean? Well, flight training in the US is governed by what we call Part 61. Part 61 is where the regulation lives for becoming a pilot. You want to be a private pilot? What does it take? You go into the regulation, and you're probably not going to do this because it's boring and dry, and then you look at all the requirements, and it's going to be located under Part 61. Now, the FAA at one point, the FAA said, well, we are going to approve a bunch of schools under Part 141, and these schools are going to be able to teach these licenses with lower minimums. Remember the 40 hours that I talked about, the 250 for commercial? The FAA is going to say, well, these schools, because we're going to oversee everything that they do, we're going to let them do the training in a lower amount of time. This is very beneficial. A Part 141 school is going to be very beneficial when you get to commercial. Commercial is 250 if you do it Part 61, but if you go to Part 141, it's going to be 190 hours. So you're saving 60 hours right there if you do it in the minimums, okay, which is easier to do with commercial. But if you do it in the minimums, then you're going to get 190 right there. So consider this when a school tells you, well, we are Part 141, it's something to consider. You'll be able to train with lower standards. Now you might say, what about private? What about instrument? Private is 35 hours instead of 40, but remember the average is 60, so it doesn't really matter at this stage. And then for instrument, there is a lower standard as well, but it also doesn't make that big of a difference. So this is important for a commercial. Now people say, can you do private and instrument Part 61 and then do commercial Part 141? Absolutely, yes you can. Okay, so something again to consider. The important part, money, right? Because this is expensive. So some tips that I've kind of put together over time. The more often you fly, the cheaper it's going to cost at the end. Now, let's think about this. The more often you fly, the cheaper it's going to be at the end. If you fly 5 days a week or 4 days a week, the knowledge is always going to be fresh in your head. You're always going to be thinking, okay, this is what we did yesterday. This is fresh. I can move to the next lesson. If you fly twice a week, or if you fly only on the weekend, you're going to fly on Saturday, you're going to fly on Sunday, and then you're going to take 5 days off. During those 5 days off, you're going to forget stuff. And when you forget, when you come back, you have to do it again. When you do it again, it costs you more money. So that's the idea right here, is the more often you fly, the cheaper the training is going to be. Another thing that I've noticed over time, if you don't have all of the money available, all of the funds available for your training, then it's going to cost you more money in the long run. And the reason I'm saying this is, let's say that you were supposed to, it was going to cost you $5,000, okay? And you only have $2,500. you're going to go through that 2,500 pretty quickly. And then you're going to be ready to continue, but you don't have the money. So you're going to take a break, and we're going to go back to step number 1. Because you took a break, then when you come back, you're going to lose knowledge, and then you have to do it all over again. It's going to cost you even more money. So have all the money available if you can. That's going to save you money in the long run. Another thing, this is from the interview that I was telling you about that's on our YouTube channel. Study before your flight. Study before your flight. The instructor, right before you go to that lesson, the day before, or the last time that you met with the instructor, he or she is going to say, hey, next week, we're going to be learning about steep turns. So what do you do before you go to the airport? You're going to review how you do steep turns. You're going to review how you do stalls. You're going to get ready for your cross country. You're going to watch my ground school, and you're going to watch everything about a specific topic. And when you show up for your lesson, the instructor is going to be like, wow, you're ready to go. And then that's going to save you a ton of money because you're ready. Now the instructor doesn't have to spend 30 or 45 minutes on the pre-brief in order to teach you something because you already know it. So that's a big tip right here. And then the last one is to observe. Actually, there's 2 more after this. Observe flights. Observe flights if possible. You can sit in the back of the airplane. Find a friend at the flight school that's doing the same thing that you are, and then sit in the back and observe what they're doing. You just stay there, you quiet, but you're gonna see everything that they do. When I did my private pilot training, this is what I did. I sat, I had my roommate, and we were exactly on the same page. Our goal was to go to the same school afterwards, so we were on the same page. You know what I would do? I would sit in the back and I would write down. His name was Julian, and I said, and when we finished, I would go, hey, Julian, you did this, you did this, you did this. And we would split. We would go on cross country somewhere. He did leg number 1, then we would swap, and then we would do leg number 2 on the way back. And he would do the same thing. And I can tell you, when you sit there and you look at your friend flying, and you're like, why is he not looking at his altitude? We're descending. And then when you sit in the front, you're going to do exactly the same thing. But that's going to click in your head. You're going to be like, hey, Julian didn't hold his altitude on the way out. Then I'm going to do it because now I've learned why he wasn't doing it. So it gives you a completely different perspective, and it really helps. This is free. This is free, available to you. Sit in the back of the airplane. Use the sim. This thing right here, you can't log the hours in this thing, but you can use it to practice your procedures. How do you do a stall? You reduce power, you pull back on the control, you use your rudder, and then eventually you stall, you drop the nose, you add power, okay? That's a procedure. Everything I just said is something that you can practice in the simulator. It's not going to be 100% exactly like in the airplane, but by the time you get in the airplane, you don't have to think about, how do I do stalls again? Oh yeah. Let me pull out the checklist. Boom, you just wasted a few minutes and you've paid for these minutes of flight time. So practice in the sim. And then the last thing is find a ground school with lifetime access, because then you can keep watching all the videos over and over again when you go. If your instructor said, hey, next week we're going to do a ground lesson and I'm going to test you on METARs. METARs is a way to read the weather. And so you go to my video and you watch Greg talking about METARs for an hour. And by the time you show up for your lesson, the instructor is like, well, I don't have to teach you anything. You already know about METARs. I just saved you $70 right here from not spending an hour with your instructor. So that's very important right here. So lifetime access, this is what we offer for our ground school. Okay. Another question we get all the time. How quickly can I finish ground school? Well, as quickly as you can learn all the topics. That's really the answer. It's 35 hours of videos. You're going to have to read some assignments. You're going to have to do some quizzes, practice exam. In reality, it's going to take you about 50 to 60 hours of total time of training in order to do this, okay? If you do this 1 hour per day for 5 days, it's going to take you about 3 months to do it. Now, remember what I said before? Everything in aviation takes longer than expected. So that 3 months, you can probably say about 4 months and be on the safe side. When I teach at the university level, this is what we do. About an hour a day, 5 days a week, and it takes an entire semester to teach that. And that's fast. That's, I always equate it to drinking from the fire hose. This is what we tell the students on their first semester. This is what it's going to feel like because all this information is getting in your face. I would say if you have the time to dedicate to it, do it over 4 or 5 months. Take your time, learn everything you can, don't rush through it. And then the next question is, how quickly can you do this, the flight training? Well, the flight training is 60 hours. We said that's the average. You're going to do a couple more ground lessons in here. If you fly 2 or 3 times a week, which you might be able to do, an hour and a half per lesson, then it's going to take about 4 or 5 months. Now, ticker right here. Cancellations. The weather is not always going to be good. The maintenance is not going to be good. You're going to get to the airplane and something is wrong with the airplane and you have to come back and cancel the flight. You're going to be sick. Your instructor is going to get sick. You're going to have to do ground lessons every once in a while. So in all reality, about 6 months to do the private pilot is what I would say. Now, if you do an accelerated program, this is completely different, okay? But in all reality, if you're doing this kind of the casual way, this is how long it's going to take. Just take it from my experience. Again, everything takes longer. It's going to cost more money. And another question we get, do I need to have a degree to become a pilot? And the answer is no, except. So no, if you do a private pilot instrument rating, if you just want to fly for fun, even if you just want to be a commercial pilot, not an ATP, just a commercial pilot, then you don't need to have a degree. If you want to fly for an airline, they're going to require that you have a degree, a 4-year degree. And guess what? They don't care what your degree is in. And I'm saying this for a reason, because you have to think about fallback. If something happens to you, what is it that you want to do if you can't be a pilot? Your medical certificate is always going to be the hanging card. If you can't pass that medical certificate for whatever reason, okay, and you can't always control your health, unfortunately, what do you have to fall back? Do you want to do something in finance? Do you want to do something else? In this case, then you have a 4-year degree that you can fall back on. So that's my tip to you. If you get a 4-year degree and the airlines don't care what you have, as long as you have a 4-year degree, do it in something that is going to be your fallback eventually. All right? The big part, money, cost. How expensive is it? And like I said at the very beginning, let's be realistic here. This is expensive. This is an expensive hobby if you do it as a hobby. If you do it to become a commercial pilot, it's an expensive investment. I'm going to say that term again, investment. You are investing money into your career, because down at the end, if you become an airline pilot, well, let's face it, that $70,000, $80,000, $90,000 that you may spend on your flight training, you're going to have plenty of money to repay it, okay? So it's a big investment. I know the number seems high, and this is not for just private pilot, this is for everything, but again, you have the payback at the end, the return on investment, the ROI, that's the term you're looking for. So what are you paying for? You are paying for airplane hours. You're paying for every time you turn on the engine, all the way until you turn it off, you're going to be charged by the flight school for that. And this is going to be done in 6-minute increments. And the reason is the ticker, we have a little ticker inside of the airplane is going to tick every 6 minutes. So you're going to record it before, you're going to record it after, and then here are your, how much you're going to get charged for. Some flight schools, be careful with this. Some flight schools charge a dry rate. That dry rate is the airplane without the fuel cost. And then on top of it, they're going to add the fuel cost based on the price of the fuel at that time. So sometimes they're going to say, well, the airplane is $90 an hour, but then you have to add another $40 or $50 on top of it for the fuel. So be careful when you see something that's very low in terms of the fuel cost of the airplane cost, it's probably because it's a dry rate as opposed to a wet rate. You're going to pay for your instructor. You're going to pay for the instructor when you spend time with him or her in the sim or in the airplane. You're going to spend time when you do a briefing before and after your flight, and then when you do ground lessons. So if you, throughout your training, the instructor is going to make sure you know your ground stuff, and this is basically where it's going to be located right in here. You're going to spend time, you're going to spend money on supplies. A headset, I said 200 or 300, I don't remember what I said for the cost of the headset, but it wasn't 150. 150 is on the very low end. This is a disposable headset, okay? You're going to use it and then eventually it's going to die. I'm not saying you should spend $1,000 on a headset, but if you're going to do this as a professional, spend money, good money on a headset. I still have my headset from 20 years ago, and guess what? It still works, okay? Logbooks, $20. The flight bag, $50 to $100, depending on the type that you get. A knee board is another $20. Your charts, your flashlight, your plotter. I put charts in there twice. You only need it once. It's another $50 right here. And then the fee for the examiner, it's going to be $500 to $800. Okay, so that's another cost you need to take care of. Your ground school, that's actually the cheapest part of all of this. You get 35 hours for $274. That's about $8 an hour. So that's a pretty good deal if you ask me. And then your written exam is $160 with the FAA, and the medical exam is $100 to $150. Now, I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying this because I want to be realistic with you. I don't want you to go to a flight school and say, oh, it's only $5 grand. That's pretty cheap. It's not going to be $5 grand because you have all these expenses on top of it. And probably the $5 grand was just for bare minimums. So in reality, a private pilot on average, what we see from talking to our customers at Pilot Institute is about $8,000 to $14,000, depending. It's the big gap, right? This is $6,000 gap right here. It depends on the airplane that you fly. It depends on where you live. If you live in a metropolitan area, it's going to be more expensive. If you live in the middle of nowhere and you have a small airport, it's going to be cheaper. So it really depends, okay? Remember, minimum versus average. If somebody tells you it's $5,000, it is not based on minimums. If they tell you that they train all of their students in the minimums, you run away because they're lying, okay? They will not train you to the minimums. There's very few flight schools out there that I know. Actually, there's no flight schools out there that I know that train everyone to the minimums. So don't get roped up into this. Okay, we're almost done. Are we still flying that? Hey, we're still flying. That's good. That's good. We haven't crashed yet. How to find a flight school. This is something that actually is pretty easy to do. Go to Google, go to your local airport and type flight school in Google. If you go to your local flight school, there's going to be a sign somewhere that said there's a flight school. Go talk to them. Go look at their airplane. Go talk to students that fly there. See if they like it. Look at reviews online of these flight schools. Are they good reviews or bad reviews? You may need to travel a little bit in order to do this, okay? You may need to go to another airport. Sometimes, I know I had a student not too long ago asking me and saying, you know, I found this flight school, but I don't like the answers that they're giving me based on the questions that I found on the online ground school. So I'm gonna go to this flight school, which is further away, but is actually gonna provide me better training. So that's a decision you have to make. If there are no options in your area, consider traveling to a location. Take a few weeks off, go to a place, rent, and then do all your training. That's going to be a good motivation for you to get done with this thing, okay? Or you can try to find an instructor. If there's no flight schools locally, go to the airport, see if you can talk to someone that has an airplane and say, hey, is there somebody here that instructs? And then see if somebody will help you to do that. So that's also one way of doing it. Last thing I want to talk about is how to get started. The first thing I recommend that you do, find out if this is for you. And if this is for you, then go do a discovery flight. And when you do your discovery flight, it's a 30-minute flight with an instructor. They're going to let you fly the airplane. They're going to let you have fun. And I guarantee you're going to catch the bug right there. And you're going to say, this is the coolest thing I've ever done. Take my money, all right? And then we have, the next step is to get your medical certificate. I've told you why before, so I'm not going to rehash this, but make sure that you can pass the medical certificate. When you're ready and you know you want to do this, enroll in our ground school. You have the link above right here. And I'm saying enroll in our ground school. I know this sounds like a sales pitch. Find the ground school that works for you, okay? If it's not mine, I'm not going to be offended. My training style is not for everyone. It's for a lot of people. A lot of people really enjoy it. We get really good reviews. But if you find a flight school that works better for you, by all means, go do it. Find something that works for you that's going to make you successful. That's what I want to convey right here. And then when you're done with the ground school, go find a flight school that's going to work for you as well. And again, when you're in the ground school, the reason I put the flight school at the very end is because I give you a lot of tips in the ground school to choose that flight school. So make sure you do this. Then you start your flight training, do your ground training at the same time, pass your written exam, pass your solo, finish everything. Congratulations, you are a private pilot, and that's exciting. Okay. All right. We are right on 1 hour, which is pretty awesome. I want to check on where we are on this thing right here. We are 20 minutes away. We are 20 minutes away from Tucson, okay? This took an hour to do this presentation, and then now we are at 3 hours and 18 minutes. This is how long it would have taken us. So in an hour and 20 minutes, we would be in Tucson right now. A beautiful area, by the way, Tucson, if you've never been there. But I'm ready for Q&A. So I don't know how I need to hand you this back out, right? And share. There you go.
All right. Greg, fantastic presentation. And
thank you.
There's been a lot of comments and questions in here. And so I've been jotting them down. There's just a few that I'd like to dive into. So one of the first questions here, this one I really liked. Brian says, is 53 too old to learn how to fly?
I'm nodding, not to say you are too old. I'm nodding because we get that question a lot. No, it's not. I have students in the ground school that are in their 70s. I even have somebody who's in their 80s doing it. As long as you're fit to fly, as long as you can pass that medical certificate, there's no age to, I always say this, to go and have fun in the airplane. So so go and do it, jump on it. Now, I'm going to put a caveat on this. It is too old to become an airline pilot. The airlines have a 65-year-old deadline for becoming an airline pilot. So once you're 65, you have to retire, you have to get out of it, regardless of how good of a shape you're in. But if you want to fly for fun, absolutely, go for it.
So we had an interesting question here from Alexi. So Alexi brings up the point that actually, once you start looking into a flight sim, you know, if you're like building a computer, he says, I'm really interested in the opinion of flight sims versus real life flying money, especially with VR. The hardware could cost a couple of $1,000s, which is about, you know, a third of the flight training. So in that case, would it make more sense to pay for just additional hours?
So that's a really good question. What I'm going to say about this is amazing, especially Microsoft Flight Sim 2020. I've been playing with this for a week now, or almost 2 weeks now, and it's just amazing. Now, what I find from students that spend a lot of time in Flight Sim without spending a lot of time with instructors is that they get bad habits. Because I'm going to go back to what I said earlier, which is you don't know what you don't know. So if you start learning on the sim and you get bad habits, those are really difficult to get rid of. Use the sim, like I've said in the presentation, to practice your maneuvers, to practice your flow, learning where the buttons are, learning your checklist, learning how to do slow flight, steep turns, and all of that. But don't use it as a replacement for proper instruction. And I hope this makes sense for everyone listening.
Hector in the chat asked something interesting. Hector in the chat says, I'm located in a state where marijuana is legal. If I smoke marijuana, am I able to get like any of the categories of medical clearances?
That's a really good question as well. Now, remember that the FAA is a federal agency, which means that they go by federal regulation, and marijuana is still illegal federally, which means that you can't use it when you fly as a pilot. So no, I would say that that's not something that you want to be using when you go for your medical, because that's going to disqualify you. And if it's anywhere in your system, if you have an accident or an incident, then you're definitely going to get in trouble. So it is still in the regulation that you cannot fly while using marijuana.
So a couple of folks are asking in the chat, Gary has something interesting. He says, do you need any special certification if you're flying like an older restored aircraft, like even like a restored World War II aircraft?
Nope, that's all going to be based on the weight of the aircraft. So if it's heavy enough, then it requires a type rating, like I've said for the Boeing and the Airbus type of airplane. If it's smaller, then all you need is a private pilot certificate and somebody to teach you how to fly that airplane in the first place, but no specific certificate.
So someone asked a related question to the one earlier from Hector, and they say, if I have a prescribed medication for an illness, I think they say a mental illness, is that going to be an issue getting an ATP license?
It depends, and I hate to say it depends because that's kind of the go-to answer, but it depends on the type, and the FAA actually has a list. So what I recommend that you do is you go on Google and just type FAA medical certificate standards, and then it's going to bring up, make sure you go on the actual FAA website, which is faa.gov, when you find the list. And then in here, there's a lot of information that tell you about what you can and can't use for medication, what's going to disqualify you from getting a medical certificate. And there's a lot of details. That's why I said it depends. But they have a full list of medication that you cannot use while you're flying because it's forbidden.
So looking in the chat here, we have a few kind of related questions from Habiba and from Caden. And so Caden says, what's the best plan for students that's in high school? Where should they start? And Habiba says, I'm in college. I want to get my degree first before starting my pilot path. Is there anything I can do in college to prepare for the pilot career?
So that's good. Those are really good questions. For a high school, and I'm going to do two answers. For a high school student, I would say start with ground school. If you are 14 or 15, then I would say start with ground school for right now. When you're 15 and over, then you can start flight training. And the reason I'm saying this, you can start flight training at any age you want, but you cannot solo until you're 16. You cannot get your certificate until you're 17. If you start before you're 15, you're going to be spending a lot of time trying to spread that training over a whole year to get to your first solo. So I don't recommend that. But the ground school, you can do at any age, and you can start learning at any age, and you'll never lose that knowledge. So start to do the ground school. And then when you get to about 15 and a half, get into an airplane so that you can solo on your first 16th birthday, and you can do your license on your 17th birthday. And that's the most awesome thing to do. In terms of college, if you want to get college out of the way first, there's nothing wrong with that. Get your 4-year degree out of the way. And then as soon as you're done with your degree, take a little bit of time off before you get a job. If you have collected the money, if you have the money available, and just do flight training. Do it for a year. And if you want to be an airline pilot, find a school that's going to get it done in about a year or a year and a half. And then you're ready to go fly for the airline. So that is one way of doing it as well.
So we have a question from Alejandro here. And we had like another question similar to this, which is asking about, like, I think they were from Canada. Alejandro says, I'm from Mexico and I do my pilot training in the USA. And if I get my license in the USA, can I fly Mexican tail numbers? And we had someone else who was from Canada asking how applicable what you're talking about is to the Canadian system.
Really good questions. So in terms of getting your license in the US and then going to a different country to fly, I don't remember about Mexico. I'll have to check on that. But with Canada, there's an agreement where you will be able to get your license converted. It's some paperwork that you have to do. And then you'll be able to convert your private pilot into a Canadian private pilot, and then you'll be able to fly. Now, my understanding is that most countries in the world have an agreement with the FAA and vice versa, where you can do that. So I'm going to assume that Mexico is the same way, and you'll be able to convert your license to a Mexican license and then be able to fly doing it that way.
This is my own question here, but does the way that typically work, can you hold both at the same time so that you could, for instance, fly over the border?
Yep, absolutely. And you can fly, you can take off from the US to go fly to Mexico or to Canada using your private pilot license. So that's okay. It's usually flying an airplane on the opposite side, flying within the country where you need to have this special certificate. So I would say for Mexico, go on the Mexican authority, the equivalent of the FAA, on their website, and then find how you can convert your FAA license to a Mexican license. And for Canada, do the same thing.
All right. So we're actually a little bit over time here. We're getting close to what we have for the time slot. So we'll maybe take one more question. But in the meantime, while I wait for our last question to come in, I'd love if everyone could just say in the chat, thank you to Greg for coming here and sharing his time and his expertise and really so much knowledge with us. Everyone, if everyone could just say thank you to Greg for sharing all that with us. I know that I've definitely gotten a lot out of this. So I do see a last question coming in here. So Caden says, so if you start ground training while in high school and beginning flight training, you could get your private before 18, is that correct?
Yep, 17 is the minimum age, so you could get it at 17.
Okay. And everyone in the chat is saying, thank you, Greg. Thank you so much. Someone says, I wish I had seen this webinar 10 years ago.
Oh, that's awesome.
All right.
Well, I'm glad I could help.
Any final words for everyone before we sign off?
No, I would say do your research, okay? Take time to find a flight school because you want to find something that's going to work for you. You don't have to change in the middle of flight training. But any questions you have, by the way, greg@pilotinstitute.com. I'm available. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Very simple. And then, and hopefully I will see some of you guys in the course.
Yeah, and you can get that right just by clicking the button. If you're watching this live, it's right above the video. If you're watching this on the replay, there should be a link for you to click to get that right now. All right. Thank you so much, everyone, and see you all on the other side.
Thank you, Cameron.